Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening to some of you, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Adam Harris Levine. I'm Associate Curator of European Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, Canada. I'm here with my colleague, Julia Campbell-Such, who's Assistant Conservator of Frames. And we are so pleased to welcome you to Many Lives, Picture Frames in Context, a two-day online conference on the history and conservation of picture frames. For those of you that registered to attend the conference in May and have joined us despite us having to postpone, thank you so much for your patience and understanding. We're very, very pleased to welcome you all to the conference finally. Just going to welcome you all. First of all, we are coming to you from the land and territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation, land that is also the territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The land that we're operating on is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Boat Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes region. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Anishinaabe Nation. Toronto has always and will always be home to Indigenous people. I want to just talk through some logistical questions that you might have over the next few days. As you'll notice, the conference is being recorded. And throughout the conference, you will be able to ask questions using the Q&A box, which you'll see on your screen. The chat we will be using to communicate key messages to you, and so you'll have that also. Throughout the conference, we will reserve questions for the end of whole sessions. So if a session has 4 speakers, the moderator will go through all of the questions that have accumulated throughout the panel at the very end, rather than taking questions after each talk. So we're just going to go through the schedule for the next few days, just to give you a sense of what's ahead. You want to go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great.
So this morning, we're going to start off with a keynote address by Lynn Roberts called Histories of the Frame. And then we're going to move on to the first session, which Adam will moderate, with Martin Hanssen, the Bonn Diptych and its frame, Jesús Jiménez Peces, the problem of originality and documentation in Spanish frames of the 17th century. Marco Bai, who's going to talk about what really is a Maratta frame, and Federica Gigante, who's going to speak on Venetian 15th century frames.
Okay. And then that's...
We'll have a break. And then midday session moderated by Michael Gregory from Arnold Wiggins and Sons, who's joining us from London. And Jerry Allibone will be speaking on Mary Ashfield, a London frame maker from the 17th century. Géraldine Bidot will speak on notable bordure of the 18th century from Versailles. And Marie Dubois will be speaking on La Réparure in Western Europe. Research she's done on that. And then finally, I will be moderating the afternoon session. We have 5 speakers in that session. Cynthia Moyer from the Met will be speaking of a neoclassical French frame that they treated at the Met. Genevieve Tobin will be talking about gel materials for cleaning gilding. Rosario Granados will be talking about frame making in Venezuela in times of political change, 1750 to 1830. Philip Avila will speak on lacquer and lacquered frames.
Tomorrow, we'll start the day with a panel that is moderated by Lisa Königsberg, who's the president of Initiatives in Art and Culture in New York. with speakers Adrian Moore from Tate, talking about the history of frame conservation at the Tate. Flavia Cresciotti is coming to us from Munich, talking about a fascinating history in early 20th century Italy with old masters unframed. And Julia Vasquez, who's coming to us from Rome, who's looking at the very philosophy of reframing as we practice it today. Then we'll have a great session with Tess Grafland and Josefina Defau from the Rijksmuseum, talking about reframing at the Rijksmuseum. Elise Lopez from the Musée d'Orsay, talking about their collection. And then Liza Nathan at Tate Britain, talking about a very particular episode of reframing a particular painting, 3 different times. That will be moderated by our colleague Eric Burkle from the AGO here. And then finally, we'll have an afternoon session with Greg Porter and Andy Haynes from the MFA Boston, Christopher Brooks and Allison Langley from the Art Institute of Chicago, Sasha Marie LeVay from down the road at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and Allison Jackson at the Harvard Art Museums. And this session is moderated by Tracy Gill, who is a frame scholar and principal at Gill and Legatic Fine Period Frames. And then finally, to close off the whole conference, we will have a second keynote from Hubert Baya, who for many years was the conservator of frames at the Rijksmuseum. And we were very lucky to have Hubert here for 1 year as the senior conservator of frames at the AGO. So as you can see, this conference was really designed to put in dialogue the history of frames as well as the conservation of frames. At the AGO, this is a methodology that we're very proud of, that we practiced on many of our greatest projects, a collaboration between curators and conservators, and a marriage of conservation science with art history. And while these topics are sometimes isolated to their own conferences, we have found that it's incredibly productive and interesting to bring these 2 fields together. And we hope that that will be the same with picture frames. Julie and I wanted to share a bit about our own collection of picture frames and share a bit of context for the work that we've been doing for the past 3 years. So we house an enormous collection of picture frames at the Art Gallery of Ontario that came to us in 1994 and 1997 with an anonymous gift of over 1,500 historic frames. The frames had been accumulated on the London market and came from the stocks of multiple dealers. And the collection represents a range in date from the late 1500s into the early 1900s, with examples from England, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and beyond. In the wake of that gift in the 1990s, our predecessors reframed a small number of our paintings with examples from this frames collection, but in large part, the frames collection remained dormant until a few years ago. In 2020, we invited Hubert Baya to come to spend a year in Toronto and to work alongside our colleagues, Juliet Campbell-Such, who's here, and Scott Cameron, our senior framer. This was a really important year because working with Hubert, we really developed a holistic understanding of the collection here, cataloging it for a second time since the 1990s, but really taking a radical reexamination of what we have, understanding some of the great strengths of the collection, areas where there was a great deal of redundancy, and certainly identifying absences in the collection that we look to fill. Following Hubert's departure, we've continued the study of our collection, and as a result of that first year's survey, deaccessioned a select group of 312 frames that represented significant redundancies or frames with major condition issues. Julia has treated a number of frames, and she'll share some of the results of her treatments in a few moments. And we've also instituted a new labeling system for frames on view in the museum so that our visitors can understand and learn more about our collection. Also last year, this past year, we made our first acquisition of a new frame with proceeds from the sales of deaccession frames. This will continue. We're very excited about using the funds from deaccessioning to continue to purchase new frames and to address absences and gaps in the collection. And then over the next 2 years, Julia will continue to treat frames, and we welcomed Eric Burkle here. He's come along as a 2-year fellow funded by the Decorative Arts Trust, and he will help us to continue to catalog and study the collection. We're hoping this year that our frames collection will go online, so that all of you can study the collection, see what we have. And we're hoping to roll out a sort of informal frame lending program where museums around the world can borrow frames from our collection in order to reframe important paintings in their own collections, and to borrow those frames essentially indefinitely for long-term loans. We feel very, very lucky and fortunate to have this remarkable collection of frames, and we do not need them to simply sit in our vaults. Remain dormant. We really want the collection to have a life, and we're very, very happy to share. So if you are a museum colleague attending the conference and you're interested in that program, please reach out to us. We'd love to share more details. So I mentioned that we have a new labeling system. In the past 3 years, we've instituted a system where our museum labels, as you can see next to paintings, often feature a small frame logo with tombstone details about the frame below. This isn't on every single painting in the collection, but it's specifically when the painting is carrying or is wearing one of our historic frames, where we're particularly excited about the frame and want to share key details. So you see this here with this one of our beloved paintings by James Tissot, The Shop Girl, and then also a painting by Anthony van Dyck of Michel Leblanc from his period at the London court, wearing a London frame, an English frame. And so this is a new system for us. It's very exciting. We're getting lots of positive feedback. A number of our visitors ask questions all the time about our frames, and we hope that we can continue to roll this out, especially as we continue our campaign of reframing paintings in our collection with examples from the Historic Frames collection. As I mentioned, we made an acquisition recently, purchased from Arnold Wiggins and Son, actually, and we'll hear more about it from Jerry in his talk. This past year, we purchased this frame by Mary Ashfield, made in 1671 for the London fire judge, Edward Turner, one of the judges appointed to adjudicate disputes after the Great Fire of London in 1670. It's enormous. One of the difficulties about having a Zoom conference is that you have no sense of scale, but it's absolutely gigantic, and is our first example of Mary Ashfield's work in the collection, and a fascinating episode because, as Jerry will tell us more, there's a tremendous amount of archival information that survives, attesting to the circumstances of the making of this frame. And so it's really a very, very, very special example in the collection. We are so excited for it to be our newest frame in the collection. So we just wanted to show you, I'm just going to flash up a few pictures on the screen to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of the collection. This will become more useful in the coming months when the digitized collection is available online. But I've made some pairings essentially of unlike frames just to put up on the screen so that you can see some of the depth and wonderful examples. So we've just finished photographing over 1,500 frames. And you'll see that there's this photography will be made available online. This will also hopefully aid in the launch of our, as I said, informal frames lending program. It will help people to see what exactly we have here. But I'm going to turn it over to Julia so that she can share some details about the recent initiatives in reframing examples from the collection.
Thanks, Adam. So this first reframing that we did was of the self-portrait of a Czech artist, Jan Kopecky. It dates to around 1725. And as you can see, it was previously framed in a nice but pretty plain walnut Biedermeier probably frame. This frame was probably about 100 years younger than the painting. And the painting was hung in the F.B. Wood Gallery, and it was the only wood frame in a gallery full of 17th and 18th century pictures in gilded frames. So it looked a little bit incongruous in there, and kind of blended into the walls. So we decided to reframe it in this Louis XV style frame that is closer in time to the painting, and was just nicer in the context as well. The frame itself was looking a little worse for wear. It had a heavy sort of toning over the gilding, which was obscuring the original matte shine scheme of the frame. So I was able to clean that, and in doing so revealed some burnished areas of water gilding, particularly on the sides, which came to really shine. I also replaced some missing ornaments with compo and gilded and toned them to match. And for the first time, constructed a liner also to fit the painting to the frame, and water gilded that in the traditional method, and distressed it a little to match the finish of the original frame. So I originally trained as an objects conservator, so this is my first time actually doing all the work to match a painting to a frame. And it was very interesting for me to be able to do that. Next are a couple of Dutch paintings that we are reframing. This is a Jan Steen painting that was actually recently restored by or conserved by a paintings fellow, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, before the pandemic. And we've been unable to display it in its restored condition because it didn't have an appropriate frame. So this is a panel painting. We found this ripple frame in our collection that is pretty much exactly the right size and from the same time period, approximately. So this is just a mock-up, but we are intending to frame this one soon and put it on display with this Arndt's painting, Skaters on the Amstel, which is from about 1620. This, as you can see, was previously on the gallery walls in this sort of Louis XIV style frame. Looking at it a little more closely, I think it is a replica, and it looks like the ornaments are molded, not carved, maybe molded after an authentic frame. We were able to find in the collection a Dutch box frame whose profile, construction, and joinery matched almost exactly examples that I found in Van Thiel's Framing in the Golden Age book. So it's a frame that is pretty much from exactly the same time period as the painting. It's an oak frame with mitered half-lap joinery. Maybe, I don't know, yeah. Just like a really classic Dutch box frame that looks much nicer on the painting. Again, this is just a mock-up. The only problem with this frame was that it was much too big for the painting, like maybe 6 inches too big. And this presented quite an ethical dilemma for me as an objects conservator who was trained to not intervene in historic objects. So we had quite a bit of discussion and reasoning over whether it would be appropriate to cut this frame down. I know that it's fairly common practice in the frame world to cut down frames to fit paintings. But for me, this was something that I really wanted to take seriously and spend a lot of time thinking about before actually doing it. So first of all, it was very important to me to write out a very clear and transparent rationale for cutting a frame down, and to have approvals from multiple levels of the institution. So we did that, and part of the rationale was that we would preserve as much of the original joinery as possible. I did do x-rays of the frame and noticed that the construction was not entirely original. It had been disassembled and reassembled probably multiple times. There were all kinds of nails that I could see from different eras, including wire nails, especially on the back piece of the frame. So in cutting it down, we documented everything we could as thoroughly as we could, reasoned everything out, and then I recreated the original joinery on the two diagonal corners that we did cut down. So we cut it down that way. And that was an incredible experience for me to be able to use my hand tools and some cabinet making skills to recreate that original joinery and understand how someone 400 years ago would have built something. That was really, really fun. So next. So finally, we found this frame in the collection, which is incredibly unusual. It's sort of of unknown origin to us. We're not sure. It's certainly a Rococo style frame, but we're not sure if it's Spanish or from somewhere else. And I wonder if someone in the conference will be able to help us out with this. I hope so. I did do some microanatomy of the wood. It's carved all from one piece of wood. And I did do microanatomy on the wood, and it was inconclusive. It has sort of the morphology and color of walnut. That was what I was guessing, but it is not anatomically walnut. So we're still looking into what it might be. I sort of suspect it might be a tropical species, but it's as yet undetermined. Yeah, so because of the uniqueness of the carving and design, it's you can see it's got kind of a very Rococo top, and then the bottom has carvings of the instruments of Christ's Passion. So there's a little rooster there, and the hammer and pincers, and then the Veronica cloth at the bottom with the image of Christ's face on it. Because of the uniqueness of this frame and the sort of unusual size of the rebate, we decided that we would just display this frame on its own as an object in its own right, a work of art in its own right. So as you could see on the left, it was a little dirty and covered in kind of a dirt imbibed wax coating that was efflorescing. So there was kind of a whitish powdery appearance over the whole frame. And this I was able to clean. I also removed significant areas of bronze paint or brass paint, as Hubert likes to call it, that I think restored a lot of the original design elements to the frame, which was nice to see. There was a lot of original gilding left underneath this bronze paint. And I also removed and reattached this. I'm just going to use my cursor to show you this. Whole area here is actually a fill. It's kind of it was a beautifully carved fill, though not original. Oh yeah, Adam's got it. But it had detached and then been reattached and refinished in kind of not a very nice way, and there was a big crack visible, and it was not properly aligned. So I reversed the fill, removed it, reattached it in a more secure and less visible way, and then refinished kind of imitated this green marbled paint on the fill. And then at the top, very, very top, you can see that there was also a little missing piece at the top there. So I also recarved that and attached it and gilded it. So these are 3 or 4 different kinds of treatments, and this is what's really interesting to me about frame conservation is the different levels of intervention that are possible for different objects and different purposes, and the importance of use in frame conservation is really interesting to me. These are not just objects that are going to be kept under glass in a case. They have to hang on a wall. It's often support a painting, so they require a different mindset than your typical museum objects. Yeah. So I think we're gonna move on to our first.
Yeah, so I'm just thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. We've ended a little early, so just wondering if we can take a few questions about the collection in case anyone has any. And we're just gonna wait a few minutes for Lynn to get set up. So I'll keep an eye on the questions just in case any come in. Otherwise, we might just take a quick pause actually while Lynn gets set up. So I'm sorry to do that so early into the session, but
I'm seeing a question by Julia in the chat about tropical woods. And I not being a frame historian myself, I'm looking for help with Brazilian frames or Portuguese frames. That's sort of my suspicion, is that maybe it's a South American origin. That's why I was looking to see if I could figure out what kind of wood it is, but it's something that's definitely unfamiliar to me. So yeah.
I think the other thing that's really struck me about this frame is that it's incredibly thin and tall, the site. So I've wondered if actually, I don't know if this sounds silly, but to my mind, I've always wondered if it contained like a devotional print, for instance, because I'm trying to think about what else is those dimensions. It's incredibly upright and thin vertical composition. And so, it's obviously like a deeply post-tridentine object, and certainly I have to imagine that it has a depiction of the crucifixion inside of it because it has all of these carved elements of the crucifixion and Christ's passion. But yeah, we're quite curious about it because we haven't seen anything quite like it in a while. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
It really is a remarkable thing, and Julia's treatment of it completely changed it. Before it was kind of a curious object in the collection, and we weren't really sure probably what to make of it, but now I see that after treatment, and especially when Julia replaced this missing appendage here up top, it really kind of brought the whole object to fruition. So we're going to take a very short break just while we help it get set up. So if you're on a morning time zone like us, please help yourself to some more coffee. And we're just gonna we'll come back in a short bit. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to our first morning. So I'm really, really, really pleased to welcome and introduce our first keynote speaker. I don't think she needs much of an introduction in this forum because Lynn is famous in the frames world, but I'll introduce her anyway just because it's a pleasure to do so. Lynn Roberts is an art historian specializing in the history of picture frames of all periods from the 13th to the 21st century. She has worked for Paul Mitchell in London and the National Portrait Gallery, and currently works for the National Gallery in London and she has also founded and edits the Frame blog, an online magazine devoted to the study of antique and interesting modern picture frames. I know that everyone that's tuning into this conference will have availed themselves many times of the Frames blog, and what a wonderful resource it is. And we asked Lynn to start the conference by situating us in a kind of history of the history of frames. And I'm very excited to hear her remarks today. Lynn will speak for about a half an hour, and then I'll help to moderate some questions afterward that you can send in with the Q&A box. So thank you so much, and welcome, Lynn.
Thank you for such a nice introduction, Adam. Well, hello everyone. I can't see you, but I hope somebody's there listening. This is about the historiography of the frame. All the appearances it's made in books, really, but only up to a certain point, because the modern ones are so many, it wasn't possible to cover them. So I hope you enjoy the pictures at any rate. This is Histories of the Frame. The historiography of frames may seem at first glance to be one of the world's most boring subjects, on a level with the history of plastic boxes, but at least the slides are attractive, and I hope that when you've heard a bit about them, you may want to investigate at least some of these fascinating books. Art history is still quite a young discipline itself, and it's only been formally taught from around the 1840s and 50s, whilst the history of picture frames has, very disgracefully, never been taught consistently anywhere at all. It's been left to maverick students looking for new ground to colonize for their dissertations, to conservators giving talks on their recent work, to specialist schools sponsoring occasional lectures on peripheral subjects, and to rare frame conferences like this one, which pull together specialists in different areas to speak about various aspects of the frame today and through time. Frames, of course, do crop up in books on the history of art ever since the 16th century, and Vasari, who is often referred to as the father of the subject, and who completely realized the importance of the framing device to the image within. He included pen, ink, and wash frames around his own collection of other people's drawings in his Libro dei Disegni, engraved designs around the portraits of artists in his lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, and had a wooden frame with a painted cover carved to his own design for a looking glass in his house, which you can see on the right. He also mentions historical frames directly. For instance, he notes that in the mid-13th century, Margarito of Arezzo made borders and diadems and other rounded ornaments in relief, and it was he who invented the method of introducing bosses on which he laid gold leaf, which he afterwards burnished. This is in the National Gallery, and I think it's been through quite a lot of restoration, but I think the remains of the bosses are sort of there underneath the subsequent updating. It is the frames in the Libro dei Disegni, though, which are most striking and revealing. Looking at the vividness with which his pen and ink borders are married to the studies they contain, transforming them into complete works of art, it's difficult to understand why the importance of the frame as the vehicle of presentation and display hasn't lasted, along with the study of the paintings which they contained. The only place where it seems to crop up today is in postmodern papers, which are rendered almost incomprehensible by their vocabularies. I think we can be fairly certain that Vasari wasn't contemplating the figures on the frame he gave to Ghirlandaio's Old Man as deictic cues. These particular 4 women are there to expand upon the meaning of the drawing, sometimes referred to as the head of a dead man, by filling the place of mourners on the frame of a carved wall-mounted tomb. They are at the same time a slightly macabre jeu d'esprit on Vasari's part and an expression of authentic emotion matching the dignity given to the subject of Ghirlandaio's drawing. The 4 of them might have decorated a carved giltwood picture frame if there had been space for a larger structure. As it is, they have pushed into the corners of the paper and given the realism found in engraved portrait frames in the 17th century. The 2 caryatids at the top perform the function of drawing back curtains to disclose the dead man as though he were lying in state in a chapel. Without these funereal handmaidens, the drawing might have remained what it is also called, the portrait of a man with his eyes shut. As it is, Vasari has interpreted it for himself and all those who look at it, as well as displaying it like a full-scale work of art in a decorative setting. The lower drawing on the left has been given an even more realistic frame, carefully shaded to create volume and the effect of undercut layers of carving. It replicates a contemporary Sansovino frame, giving Sabatini's drawing the immediate status of a framed altarpiece. It suggests how a Mannerist painting in this style might have been displayed in the Bolognese monastery it was designed for, and that perhaps Vasari was aware of Sansovino frames in locations other than Venice. Vasari's framing of the drawings he had collected was not something copied or probably much known about by the art historians who followed him. Karel van Mander, who translated and added to parts of the lives of the painters, didn't include their engraved and framed portraits in his 1604 Schilder book, although the frontispiece is strikingly presented as a Mannerist idicule supporting figures of architecture, drawing, painting, and fame. And the author's portrait is given an oval auricular frame, complete with rather unsavory looking organic scrolls. This type of engraved portrait, had become customary in books by the 17th century and had grown out of the earlier custom of providing integral frames for its individually sold engravings made from paintings. They were never commented on, however, and although based on real frames, they inevitably included imaginary and fantastic elements. Where Vasari had used the frames he made to perform much the same purpose for his collection of drawings as frames in a real picture gallery, the frames of engraved portraits were divorced from any physical purpose, and although looking in some ways identical with wooden frames, became just another accoutrement of the sitter, like his costume, to be played with. Perhaps this helps to explain why a branch of the arts, which during the 14th to 16th centuries had produced altarpieces in partnership between carvers, gilders, and painters working on equal terms, became decreasingly important in comparison with painting, and was hardly likely to be written about in the same terms as the work of Michelangelo or Rembrandt. Diderot's mid-18th century encyclopedia is really the first work to get to grips with what a frame or bordure is, either for a painting or a print, or a stucco division on a decorated wall or ceiling. His explanations are disappointingly brief, although backed up with a quotation from Reflections on Painting by the Abbot Dubois. So this is one of his explanations. Frame or bordure, as in architecture, is a section in relief, either round or oval, usually carved with ornament, surrounding a painting, bas relief, or plain compartment panel. Versions of this with a square profile are called cadre. And his second explanation, frame, bordure, in painting, is the ornamental margin which commands the outer edge of a painting, a print, etc. A rich border, a plain border, a border of burnished gold, matte gold, etc. Frames, says the Abbot Dubois, throw a new brilliance onto colours and seem, by causing neighbouring objects to stand out from each other, to unite better the parts of which they are composed. And that's all you get from Diderot. The encyclopedia has one volume composed of plates of illustrations for the whole work, amongst which, rather than images of, for instance, examples of frames in different styles, there are scenes of workers in various fields, the métier of the title. The plate for sculpture en bois shows carvers and joiners in a workshop producing panels of decorative boiserie for the interior of a room, figural sculptures and picture frames, whilst another more famous plate has people gilding and finishing frames. For Diderot, frames are technology rather than art. Diderot's massive work was followed 130 odd years later by Henri Havar's Dictionnaire. Havar, under cadre in volume 1, takes a quick scamper in 6 pages through the history of the frame from the 16th century to the 1880s, and gives us 4 images, including in the center of the slide, a Sansovino frame on a rather surprised French Renaissance woman, and an empty Mannerist frame covered with scrolls and masks and animals. Volume 2 provides 5 closely printed pages of information on framing and frame makers, along with images of a sculptural door frame, 2 tapestry frames, a looking glass, a portrait in a Mannerist frame, right on the slide, and the trompe-l'oeil painted frame for a mural in Versailles. These are probably the earliest and most comprehensive, if still very brief, published pieces on different types of frames and their histories. It's the first to offer illustrations of individual frames along with this information, and it's the place where any historiography of frames must begin. The next most notable and influential book on frames was written by the collector and dealer Michelangelo Guggenheim, who was also a manufacturer of revival furniture in Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo styles. He had been born to German parents in Venice in 1837 and had inherited their collecting tastes, taking their small antiques gallery to an empire-building level with 3 large workshops, a global export business, and a prestigious shopfront on the Grand Canal. In 1897, he published Le Cornici Italiane, an album of important Renaissance frames on a grand scale from the mid-15th to the end of the 16th century. It comprised 100 black and white plates showing a total of 120 frames, with a 19-page history of the subject, and drew on his phenomenal knowledge of his subject, perhaps especially of antique woodwork. The 120 frames he illustrated were the best specimens he knew of amongst Italian Renaissance patterns, including, for example, the little noticed original frame on Previtali's Madonna and Saints, the one up in the top left, including, for example, hanging unregarded in the sacristy of San Giobbe. He was not only concerned with recording their history, but also with explaining the effect which frames could have on paintings and the advantage a picture could gain from being properly framed. This combination of knowledge and connoisseurship meant that his book quickly became a classic reference work, used in schools of art and design, and influencing the choices made by curators, artists, exhibition designers, and collectors. It was taken up enthusiastically by dealers like Joseph Duveen. The Duveen brothers had built up a sizable transatlantic traffic in paintings from the homes of impoverished British aristocrats to the opulent houses of American entrepreneurs. These works sold much better when they were set off by richer, less shabby, or more chronologically connected frames, and Guggenheim's illustrations became a pattern book for reframing Italian Renaissance paintings. The page at the top of the slide from a Duveen album of photos is marked Veneto for the style of frame, Benson for the collector to whom this painting had belonged, and Venoni for Ferruccio Venoni. He was a Sienese carver and gilder who had established a business in Florence and did a great deal of work for Duveen. He was able not only to copy antique frames accurately, but to adapt them in size, proportion, and detail, making him doubly valuable to Duveen, and the Guggenheim illustrations even more useful. Private clients, such as the 6th Earl of Harwood, also employed Venoni. Here, at the bottom right, is another example of the Previtali frame, with proportions similar to the original and with different details from the Duveen version. This use of Guggenheim's work in different countries and for private collectors and museums indicates the great hunger there was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for accurate information on antique frames and for illustrations of original frames as references. Some collectors and curators really wanted to be able to display their paintings in a fashion approximating as nearly as possible the original context. One particular museum curator who was intensely interested in the concept of appropriate framing was Wilhelm Bode, who directed the Gemäldegalerie Gallery and later the combined museums of Berlin in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was friends with both Michelangelo Guggenheim and his exact contemporary, the Florentine dealer Stefano Bardini, corresponding with them and buying from them both in his quest to set up a museum which would present all kinds of art in an integrated display. This vision meant that he wanted both paintings and relief sculptures to be framed as authentically as possible, an idea which he achieved in the 1890s and which inspired him to write a history of frames. It was published in 1898 in the journal Pan as Picture Frames in the Past and Present, and is the first comprehensive and serious history by an art historian and museum curator. Bode was an expert in many areas, writing about Italian Renaissance painting, sculptures, maiolica, bronzes, furniture, and tapestries, as well as producing studies of Rembrandt, Leonardo, Botticelli, and others. With the help which Guggenheim and Bardini could give him from their practical experience, he was perfectly placed to write a history of the one thing which united all the disparate elements of an interior, the frame. His article is motivated partly by disgust with the frames of his own age, the meretricious revivals of older styles made in cheap wood and stucco and brightly gilded, and partly by his work reframing old master paintings for the Gamalda Gallery. This process, which brought him into close contact with Guggenheim and Bardini, taught him a great deal about the original frames of different periods and nations. His favorite nationality was Italian, and his favorite time the Renaissance through to the Baroque, closely followed by the Low Countries in the 17th century and their Mannerist frames, Lutmar, auricula, and trophy. Italian frames and their development, especially in Florence and Venice, take up 6 pages of the 13.5 pages of text in his article. Netherlandish take up 3, and the introduction another 3, leaving very little for French frames, while Spanish and English frames are barely mentioned. Bode's history is thus heavily weighted in the direction of his own interests and where he feels the true artistry of frames lies. He thinks that Bolognese frames are expressionless, uniformly finished and boring, like all Bolognese art of that time, as he says. And since the Bolognese frame of the 17th century became the starting point of the French Baroque frame, in his words, French frames are definitely handicapped in reaching their full potential. It is depressing that so much knowledge and effort should have been expended on producing what must have been the ultimate museum, only for many of the frames, which were often stored separately from the paintings during the Second World War, to be destroyed. It's not possible to match colour photos of the frames to all of Bode's black and white illustrations in the same way as the auricular frame on the Emmanuel de Witt and the Sansovino frame on the Lutmar, because they no longer exist. The Rossellino relief of the Madonna and Child at the centre of this hang in the museum was also caught in a wartime fire and broken. The relief itself could be patched up because a plaster cast of it had escaped undamaged. However, the beautiful tabernacle frame with its acanthus leaf apron, segmental pediment, and delicately carved acroteria has completely vanished. Bode's viewpoint is slanted. He believes that, quote, even the Rococo picture frame was less developed in France and England than in Germany, although he's quite keen on Louis XVI and neoclassical styles. But it's his knowledge of Renaissance frames, his wish to educate the art world in that knowledge, and his vision of a museum where paintings and sculpture are displayed in the context of other arts and with authentic frames, which are so clear and appealing to us today. From the late 1870s, the literature on frames began to increase, helped by the articles which critics began to write on the frames of the pre-Raphaelites and Impressionists. These were general, single, focused essays sparked by the radical influence of scientific theory on art, the appearance of plain white frames in an era of wall-to-wall gilded ornament, and the even greater shock of frames in colours complementary to the paintings. However, the generalized study of the history of frames continued to evolve around and beyond these smaller contemporary fashions. It took various forms, And as with the history of art, it continued to rely on the expertise of the collector and dealer. In the first half of the 20th century, one of the most influential of these was the Parisian designer Serge Roche, son of an artist and antique dealer, whose major work is the great folio of black and white photos of antique frames, which he assembled to accompany his 1931 exhibition of frames in Paris. This combined project was a flamboyant sweep across the panorama of historical European frames from the 15th to the 20th century, each one identified by its nationality and date, with other facts such as material, location, and dimensions where they were known and relevant. Particularly good specimens in museums and private collections filled out Roche's own frames in the folio, allowing him a more complete and historical overview. He introduced his audience to French frames from the early 16th to the 18th century, redressing Böder's emphasis on Italy and dealing with English, Spanish, Northern and German frames, as well as Italian. Because he included so many fine examples from museums and private collections, the folio as a whole is far more than an accompaniment to his exhibition, splendid and innovatory as that was. It is a paean to the status of the frame as a piece of virtuoso sculpture, sometimes one with a whole narrative laid out in its composition, or with a complex symbolic program, sometimes one where the rhythm of the decoration aspires to the condition of music, always with the magical skills of the carver fully revealed. The inclusion of 3 out of 5 surviving early 16th century altarpiece frames from the Cathedral of Amiens, ranging in height from 173 to 383 centimeters, that's 5'8" to 12'6", beautifully and sharply photographed in black and white, discloses the relationship of such altarpieces to architecture, marble funerary sculpture, and metalwork shrines. And because they are shown without their paintings, the viewer is forced to see them not as mere accessories, but as soaring Gothic chapels with columns of petrified trees and forests of finials, inhabited by figures, beasts, and birds. There are 2 more important general histories of frames and 1 more 20th century exhibition, which everyone interested in the subject should know about, although the last quarter of the century had already seen it reach a tipping point, at which it had begun to split into more specialized and focused studies. The first of these histories is by Henry Heidenreich, a member of a firm of frame makers which was founded in Amsterdam in 1845, added branches in Belgium and London, and finally in 1936 opened a branch in New York. Heidenreich's book, The Art and History of Frames, published in 1963, begins in the 13th century, continues to the later 19th century in Europe, and includes 2 Spanish frames in its collection of 100 images. For the first time, it also includes a section on American frames from the 18th century, taking the history up to the mid-20th century. It's extremely readable, succinct, and very well illustrated, and it's the sort of book which ought to be on the bookshelves of every school, art and conservation department, but most importantly, on the desk of every single paintings curator, along with the second book, which is Klaus Grimm's 1978 Alte Bilderrahmen, translated as the Book of Picture Frames. Grimm's book is a larger, longer, more sophisticated and complex version of Heidenreich's, with a very useful 21-page essay, a glossary, illustrations of designs for frames, engravings of frames, frames in paintings of interiors, and frames in architecture elevations. The main part of the book is a pictorial history divided into nationalities and styles, with brief notes on the captions. This makes it very easy to see how patterns travelled and evolved and how they differed in different countries. The timeline begins in the 2nd century AD with the gilded stucco frame from a Roman Egyptian mummy portrait. It includes more Spanish frames and also brings in Scandinavian frames for the first time. It's an invaluable portmanteau of period styles and nationalities, providing a constant core of examples from which it is nearly always possible to discover some identifying factor for a puzzling frame. It is unmistakably the work of a professional academic and frame historian, and it's all the more admirable considering that it was written from a standing start by someone quite young who absorbed years of experience in the time it took to produce the book, and who has managed to gather an extraordinary amount of information in that time. The Art of the Edge, European Frames from 1300 to 1900, is an important exhibition catalogue from the historical point of view. It covers a very useful group of more than 70 frames and includes an illuminating essay from each of the authors. It's also notable as an exhibition assembled entirely, all 600 years of it, from the Art Institute of Chicago's own collection. Even the recent exhibition of frames at the Louvre, although large, covered only 3 centuries overall. The period since the 1980s has seen the literature open out into a colourful diversity of books and articles on the materials, makers and designers of frames, as well as surveys of smaller areas, national, style-based, or limited to more narrowly focused periods. What is needed now is for these multiplying interests to become much more essential elements in the study of the relevant art. Paintings should automatically be seen in the contexts for which they were made. If the history of collecting can become relatively quickly a major subsection in the history of art, how much more important should it be to look at the setting for which the artist knew he was working, either very specifically or in more general terms. Paintings should never be seen as two-dimensional objects on the flat pages of a book. They have volume and texture. They hang on walls within a 3-dimensional space or stand on altars with buttresses supporting them. And for nearly all their millennia of history, they have relied on frames to protect them, bind them to their location, isolate them from distraction, and explain them through symbol and ornament. When they are taken from their original homes to museums, they deserve to be given back some of their context. If not their first frames, then something contemporary and appropriate, as well as the odd chair, console, wall hanging, or chest. They also deserve that every curator should know something about these contexts, and it is up to all of us to make the knowledge we have available to anyone who wants, needs, and ought to learn. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I hope you can see the flurry of applauses that are appearing on the Zoom screen, and heart emojis.
Oh, that's so sweet.
We're getting tons and tons of visual applause from from nearly 250 people who've tuned in from around the world to hear your talk.
It's like confetti.
Lynn, you have given us so much to think about, and I'm really glad that we can anchor the conversations that will follow for the next 2 days in historiography and really think about, I feel very fortunate that we have such an intense interest in the history of frames at this moment, and it's exciting to see it come out of the history that you've raised for us today. So we're going to transition over to our first panel now. And I'm going to just resume screen sharing. So I'm just gonna, I'll be moderating this morning's first panel, which has 4 talks from Martin Hanssen, who is coming to us from the Friedrich-Schiller-University in Jena, Jesús Jiménez Peces from the Complutense University in Madrid, Marco Bai from the Scuola Normale Superiore, and Federica Gigante from the University of Cambridge. So it's a densely packed session. So I'm just we'll put their extended bios in the chat. You can read more about them there, but I want to give them more time for their presentations. And as the session goes, you can add your questions to the Q&A, and I will moderate a Q&A at the end. But I'm very, very pleased to welcome Martin Hanssen to speak on the Bonn Diptych and its frame, technical investigations into an unusual devotional object. Martin, thank you so much, and please take it away.
Yeah, greetings, everyone. And thank you to you, Julia and Adam, for organizing this conference and inviting me to talk about the intriguing case of the Bonn Diptych and its frame in particular. Here we go. Painted around 1485, these 2 small panels representing the Descent from the Cross and the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, referred to as the Bonn Diptych, are attributed to an anonymous lower Rhenish master. The pictures are today framed in 2 fairly similar rectangular frames with lavish moldings and architectural ornaments, which are richly polychromed. Already upon first glance, the frame of the Martyrdom stands out as a much older, late medieval frame, with its original polychromy partially intact, after which the frame of the Descent from the Cross was later crafted. My colleague Katharina Liebetrau, conservator at the LVR Landesmuseum in Bonn, and I began technical examination on the 2 panels in September 2023. Since then, we were able to generate fundamental insights into the genesis of the paintings, their supports, and their framing, respectively. Based on these investigations, I am happy to present parts of our research with particular focus on their framing history. I would like to start by addressing the provenance of the 2 pictures, as this is of utter importance for the question of their current framing. Then I will continue with an in-depth analysis of the construction and current state of the martyrdom frame and the many changes it underwent. And finally, I will close with a brief prospect on what the original context of this frame may have been. As the labels on the reverses inform us, both paintings were formerly in the collection of the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin, yet they entered the collection separately. The martyrdom, here to the right, having been acquired already in 1851. At the Gemäldegalerie, as with the over 1,100 pictures in the collection, the panel was initially placed in a so-called Schinkel frame, a gilded frame with an ogee profile and applied with ornaments of metal palmettos, designed by Carl Friedrich Schinkel at the time of the museum's opening in 1830. Unfortunately, the archival documents in Berlin do not inform us if the painting had been acquired in 1851 together with its original frame, which was then removed and replaced by a Schinkel frame, or if the panel entered the collection already independently. This obviously unsuitable Schinkel frame was later replaced over the course of a long-running reframing campaign at the gallery, initiated by Julius Meyer, who was appointed director in 1872, with Wilhelm Bode as his assistant, who, as Lynn already showed, when he himself took over as director in 1890, continued the collection's reframe. Following the example of the National Gallery in London, it was their intention to source antique frames to replace the Schinkel frames with authentic originals, while trying to match the period and the original location of each work in question. While this undertaking took shape comparatively easily for the Italian, Spanish, Dutch, French, and English schools, providing the collection of early Netherlandish and early German paintings with authentic frames proved rather difficult. On the Netherlandish and German pictures, Bode notes in a 1912 article, quote, "Paintings from the 15th and early 16th century have only retained their original frames, where the moldings are carved from the same piece of wood as the painted panel, or else pinned and glued to it, as for instance is the case with the panels of the Ghent altarpiece. Individual frames of this kind are almost never available for sale." End quote. Bode then mentions that he was only able to source authentic individual late Gothic frames of the right size for 2 pictures from the collection up until 1912, the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian being one of them. While again, archival documents do not allow for reconstructing when and where exactly this frame was sourced by Bode, it must have been acquired for around 1900, as is suggested by 2 consecutive editions of the gallery's directory, published in 1898 and 1904. While in the earlier directory the framing is left uncommented, the latter records that the frame does not originally belong to the picture. This observation is further confirmed by a photograph dated to circa 1900 showing Wilhelm Bode, Alois Hauser, and Max Friedländer in front of some of the collection's main works of the early Netherlandish school, in which the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, together with the newly acquired frame, are visible on the right-hand side. That both panel and frame were heavily altered so that the 2 could be combined, I will discuss in a minute. But let me briefly comment on the provenance of the Descent from the Cross, which comparatively only much later joined the Berlin collection in December 1933. It was then equipped with a close replica of the martyrdom frame to enhance the visual cohesion between the 2 pictures. This frame must have been produced shortly after its acquisition between 1934 and 1936, when the 2 pictures together with their frames went from the Gemäldegalerie to the museum in Bonn, where they are now preserved. Let me now turn to the frame that Bode was able to source for the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. The frame is rectangular in shape, today measuring 50.3 centimeters in height, 30.6 centimeters in width, and circa 3 centimeters in depth. The frame's face is ornated with several tiers of elaborately carved moldings. A narrow frame plate segues into a cavetto at the top and sides. Set on either side is a tall and slender colonnette with a round base and a capital on a likewise tall octagonal pedestal, which is separated from the picture field inwards by a narrow strip. At the top, the picture ends in an ogee arch with a high ogee profile, capped with a finial and 2 superimposed crockets on either side. From it suspends 5 half quatrefoils ending in foliage, of which today only remnants remain. A curtain of blind lancet windows, 5 on either side to the finial, is set behind this arch. On the bottom rail, the frame plate is almost twice as wide as along the sides and the top, and also drops into a cavetto towards the picture field. The face retains parts of its original polychromy. The paint was applied to a light gesso ground and has mostly not been touched up. We detected vermilion on the arch's ogee profile, black on the frame plate, the cavetto and the central band of the ogee profile, and green to fill the lancets. In addition, remnants of a dull gold on ochre bowl, which was partially reworked, are found on most of the elevated surfaces, like the finial, the crockets, and the columns, as well as the lancets. When inspecting the frame's sides and reverse, it quickly became apparent that this face was heavily altered over the centuries. First impressions of the scale of these interventions can briefly be observed on the frame's sides. The today 30mm deep frame is made up of 3 different layers of oak. Clearly visible are 2 vertical joints and the grain of each layer running in different directions. The face, measuring approximately 13 to 15 millimeters in depth, was sisted to an additional oak support of 7 millimeters depth, and later the construction was again sisted to a beveled reverse, adding an additional 8 millimeters. Our inspection of the sides revealed that the face, with its blind lancet windows, was precisely carved from a single board of oak, vertical in grain, and, as the arrangement of the annual rings demonstrates, was quarter sawn from the log, indicative of an extremely fine quality of woodwork. The dendrochronological examination identified the wood as oak from the Rhine-Meuse region and further discerns a possible felling date between 1474 and 1484, endorsing a date of this face layer for circa 1486. How close of a match Bode's find was for the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian is demonstrated by the results of the dendrochronological examination panel, where both of them cut from the same oak tree, which as well grew in the Rhine-Meuse region, but the test results speak in favor of a creation of the paintings from circa 1478 onwards. As of now, we can differentiate at least 3 alteration campaigns, leaving no doubt that the 15th century face originally must have functioned as an applied frame that only later was repurposed and altered so it could be displayed against a wall and match the martyrdom panel. It appears that in a first alteration step, the face was removed from its original context and attached to an additional sister frame, again made of oak, with the intention of turning the applied frame into a rebated frame. Additionally indicative of that may be the 2 large bore holes with a diameter of 5 millimeters that are found on the upper edge. They were drilled to the top through the layers of ground and paint at an angle, therein appearing to be a later addition, likely to attach the frame to a chain or another fixture to hang it. It seems plausible that the panel to which the face was originally applied was still present during this first step and was only later removed, as otherwise structural and dimensional modifications would have occurred together with the first alteration process. But the frame's original picture field must have matched the dimensions of the martyrdom almost perfectly. What speaks in favor of this are 2 joints which run horizontally along the tops of both colonnettes' bases and which pass through the face and the first sister layer, but not through the second. This brings me to the next step in the frame's alteration history. Before being paired up with the martyrdom, the frame was cut open on both styles, either to slightly reduce it in height or to help remove the previous picture. That this reduction was ever so slight and can only have totaled to a few millimeters is suggested by the grain continuing almost perfectly, while the mismatch might be ascribed only to the saw blade passing through the wood. Only then the frame was sisted once more and the 3rd beveled layer was added, which was joined together from separately cut members and then stained to match the rest of the frame in color. As is visible from the back, this second sistering created a rectangular opening with an unusually wide rebate for a rectangular panel, and possibly in a 3rd step, most likely undertaken in the restoration studios in Berlin after its acquisition, was heavily reduced and altered in shape to marry the frame with the martyrdom panel. Firstly, 3 narrow strips of hardwood were nailed to the opening laterally and at the bottom. Next, 2 small blocks of oak, horizontal in grain and with an ogee cut, were inserted at the top to counterbalance the arched top of the martyrdom. Then, a small flat frame only running along the sides and the bottom was inserted to narrow the picture field laterally and to bridge the difference in depth at the bottom, which is again effortfully cut from a single board of oak with no joints between stiles and the lower rail. Since circa 5 millimeters of this inserted frame were visible on the sides from the front, the strips were gilded. Concomitantly, a few areas of paint loss in the original polychromy were touched up, and an artificial patina was applied in many of the recessed areas, particularly along the crockets. Before the martyrdom could now be placed in this adjusted frame, a few structural and cosmetic modifications were made to the panel. As the X-ray of the panel shows, the original cusp of the panel's arch was straightened and an oak platelet with a tapered top was inlaid from the back to match the panel's top border to the higher cutout of the arch on the frame. Afterwards, this new joint was filled, the original barb was smoothed, and the panel's top edge together with the inlay were overpainted to conceal the addition and blend the picture with the frame. Now that we have gained a better understanding of the afterlife of this frame and the many changes it underwent, let me close with a very brief prospect of the context from which this frame may originally have come. Indeed, only very few authentic picture frames from the Netherlands and Germany from the 15th century survived, many being integral, semi-integral, or applied frames. Almost all of them, at least if applied, are assembled individual members, mostly consisting of fairly narrow strips with more or less sophisticated moldings, of an ogee, cavetto, or step design, which was then visually enhanced through paint or gilding. In comparison, our frame formally and structurally differs from many other 15th century picture frames, in it being entirely carved from a single piece of wood, instead of being assembled from individual members. Furthermore, we need to consider that our frame may originally not have been conceived for a picture that was intended to be hung, due to the flimsy nature of the lower rail being too narrow to support the weight of a panel, but instead could have only served a decorative function as an applied frame within a greater context. Its forms, as well as its technical properties, therefore recall contemporary frames of larger altarpieces from the mid to the late 15th century, and particularly that of carved altarpieces from the southern Netherlands, as beautifully demonstrated by this southern Netherlandish case dating to circa 1440-50, now at the Rijksmuseum. While the Bonn frame and the Amsterdam case do share many formal similarities, they entirely differ structurally. The latter is made up of 4 individual members, the pierced frieze, the 2 colonnettes, and the ogee arched board, which were nailed to the outer wooden structure, the former, our frame, being carved from a single board. In fact, all framework formally congruent to the Bonn frame that is found in carved Netherlandish or German altarpieces lack a lower rail altogether. Regarding frames for panel painting, however, a few, but indeed much larger applied frames, formally similar to the Bonn frame from the Netherlands and the Lower Rhine, still survive. One late example being Barthelbräun the Elder's Lamentation Triptych from circa 1555, now in Cologne. Applied to the outer wings, we find a framing structure which in its forms widely corresponds to the Bonn frame. A narrow frame plate, 2 segues into a cavetto at the top and sides, and a tall and slender colonnette on a tall, this time twisted octagonal pedestal is set on either side. At the top, the picture field here ends in a round arch from which tracery suspends into the picture. The spandrels are filled with foliage and the bottom rail drops into a cavetto towards the picture field. Due to its sheer size of 180 by 110 centimeters, this applied frame is assembled from individual pieces, of course, and therefore structurally and dimensionally diverges from the Bonn frame. Yet, it shows that applied frames for panel paintings, like the one found in Bonn, are found in Netherlandish and German altarpieces. Other examples for panel paintings, which are formally similar, appear rather frequently in larger altarpiece ensembles from 15th century Catalonia, Castile, or Leon. For example, this is the case with Nicolas Frances's gigantic altarpiece of the Lives of the Virgin and Saint Francis from circa 1445, now at the Prado, which is organized in 4 registers and a predella. The predella, which is divided into 18 individual pictures, is of particular interest for our case. All these pictures are displayed in individually applied frames that closely resemble our frame. They are of upright rectangular shape with an ogee arch in front of a lancet curtain from which tracery suspends into the picture field at the top, while simple narrow strips form the stiles, and the wider bottom rail is in the form of an inclined sill, and which are then set into the larger framing structure of the predella. Even if no similar examples of picture frames from the Netherlands or Germany seem to have survived, the Spanish examples, together with the observations made on the applied frame of Broin's Lamentation triptych, suggest that the Bonn frame once belonged to a similar context, that is, an altarpiece in which painted panels set in elaborately carved applied frames with similar architectural ornaments. To conclude, the frame under discussion here was acquired as an individual piece by Wilhelm Bode at some point between 1898 and 1904, specifically for the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. A highly remarkable find. Not only did the frame match almost perfectly in dimensions, it also dates to the same time and is made from the same wood as the panels of the Bonn diptych. Moreover, from the frame's state of preservation, we can elicit at least 2, possibly 3 stages of alteration, with the first turning the originally applied frame into a rebated frame, and the second, possibly together with the third, to modify it for the framing of the martyrdom panel. However, the frame's properties, particularly being its form and structure, presented as a highly unusual example of a surviving 15th century picture frame that was applied to a painted panel and was set into a Netherlandish or Rhenish altarpiece. In its current function, it therefore perfectly complements the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian from the Bonn diptych. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was fantastic. We're getting a lot of applause. That is a really remarkable episode of history that you have traced for us. Very excited to bring that to discussion later. The next presentation is by Jesús Jiménez Peces from the Complutense University in Madrid. His presentation, The Problem of Originality and Documentation in Spanish Frames of the 17th Century, will add wonderfully to this discussion. So we're just going to get his presentation up on the screen.
I would like to begin this communication by thanking the Art Gallery of Ontario for the initiative and organization of this Congress, and especially the great effort made with Julia Guiada. Thank you very much. I'm currently in the final stage of writing my doctoral thesis in the title Typology and Evolution of the 17th Century Spanish Baroque Framing, under the direction of the director of the Department of Art History of the University of Valladolid. I will begin with a brief tour of masterpieces from the Spanish school that I am sure you know from museums or institutions around the world. Las Meninas, Santa Emerenciana, El Bufón Calabazas, La Reina Mariana, San José y el Niño, o La Curación del Ciego. Sure enough, you guessed it, now none of them have their original frame. In the research carried out for my doctoral thesis, I have unfortunately found that when people that about the 17th century Spanish frame, they do not refer to the information collected in their archives, contracts, will, appraisals, or to the examples that are still preserved in their original location or with their frames. These have led an overall insufficient and often erroneous view of the 17th century Spanish Baroque framing. For example, in classical studies of framing, the original typologies are neither known nor studied, and this leads to numerous errors, commonplace and false attribution, presenting a vision that is not very accurate or relative. In a willful attempt at typological systemization of framing in that period, the use of already obsolete bibliography, museum guides, furniture and decoration manual, is basically recorded to and no reference is made to original source of archive. Nor do they consider in situ observation of the works that still retain the original frames, and instead resort to example of frame that house the work of the great Spanish master, scattered around the world in museum, collection, and antiquary markets, whether or not they are original. There are practically no examples of rigorous original framing. After leaving Spain, they are reframed with replica frames in a curious pseudo-Spanish style, or original frames are used that may or may not have something to do with the painter, the city of origin of work, or with the stock of the frame warehouse of its museum of usual suppliers. On the other hand, we use the information collected in the archive, contract, wills, appraisals, personal files, etc., and we studied examples finding that still preserve their original location or frame. The panorama changed radically. The objective of this communication is also to dismantle bibliographical cliches, such as the misnamed rare style, and to make known the original typologies that were used in Spain framing in the 17th century, and to explain their genesis, rise, and subsequent development. We must start from several fundamental premises that absolutely condition the Spanish framework of the 17th century. In the Spanish case, the work of the frame is absolutely subordinated to the great stenographic machine art excellence of the artistic and ideological moment, el retablo, the starpiece. The carvers, gilded, assemblers, carpenters, sculptors, or architects who make the altarpiece are those who intervene in the making of the frames. The original Spanish typology of this century are born from the ornamental and typological repertoires used in the altarpiece. The geographical centers of production have a decisive influence of the apprehension and development of the original typologies. Valladolid has an extraordinary sculptural school and was the capital in the kingdom between 1601 and 1606. Madrid was the court, and Seville was the capital of trade with America. This generated a huge demand for works of art for the palace, residence, convents, monasteries, and churches that were founded around them, or also that artists would work their art colored even when they are commissioned to work outside these cities. It is clear that there are imported models for Flanders or Italy, which from the 16th century were also widely used in the 17th century. The cold taste for the rich finished ebony veneer frame of the 16th century generated the extraordinary popularity of the ebonized frame, here using pear wood. The caseta frame with its graffito lettering or maybe become widespread in all exhibition areas, especially to those where the painting, the surrounding, the quality of the donor, of the owner of the collection were to be highlighted. There are examples of unique frameworks of great quality and inventiveness, but which did not generate significant development. But there are three types of frame that we can consider as original Spanish. The frame with gallones y piedras, the frame of the Tower de la Torre, or the Sevilla frame. In this communication, I will try to explain the genesis, characteristics, and evolution of these types for their correct identification and evaluation. I will focus especially on the frame de la Torre, which I hope will be more novel for you. The frame of gallows and stone, gallones y piedras, is generated from ornamental motifs of the Romanesque altarpiece and goldsmith elements. It adquired its distinctive character in the first third of the century and spread from Valladolid throughout Castile, the Duero Valley, and the Camino de Santiago, although there are notable examples in Extremadura and Madrid. It has been identified with Herrera, the architect of El Escorial, and as a temporal consequence, with the second half of the 16th century, both facts being rigorously false. Some words for this case. In the extensive architectural and designer work of Juan de Herrera, there is not ornamental detail that recall the so-called Herrera style. Herrera's architectural principles co-innovate from that typology. Chronologically, they are not coincident. In my opinion, this attribution is due to a popular historiographical and commercial trend that usually resort to an artistic figure of relevance at the moment, whether or not it's up to do with what is attributed to him. The difficulty of cataloging and dating the frames, the gallones y piedras, I take definition for the sculptor Gregorio Fernandez in a contract of 60-23, and the enormous relevance and artistic and symbolic power of the monastery of the Escorial, who had caused the figure of his main architect to suffer from this situation or attribution. The frame, with a caseta profile, incorporated a corner with gallons, scorpion, and hooks. The inset is covered with imitation of stones, gems, diamond points, oblongs, losanges, and an edge in which a string of pearls and biscuit are frequent. The most correct definition of the style is found in the second quarter of the 17th century, with the paintings of Jerónimo de Calabria, Tomás de Peñasco, and above all, Diego Valentín Díaz. They were made a circle of assemblers and sculptors that emerged around the figure of the sculptor Gregorio Fernández. The second style is the one used in the framing of the rearrangement of the paintings in the sacristy of El Escorial, carried out by Velázquez and his capacity as royal quartermaster. He chose a typology guidailing used in mid-century Madrid altarpiece, especially by José de la Torre, an assembler who had already collaborated with Velázquez in the redecoration and framing of the Alcázar's pictorial collection. In addition to being the king painter, Velázquez held a number of courtly posts very close to Felipe IV, such as valet and royal quartermaster. The latter involved the decoration and arrangement of his masterly apartment and also taking care of the king's collections, assuming functions that are similar to those performed today by museum specialists, that is, the conservation and restoration of paintings, the distribution in the rooms, the acquisition of new works, the programming of new decoration, and change in the decoration or rehabilitation of royal buildings such as the Torre de la Parada, the Buen Retiro Palace, the Alcázar, or El Escorial. The pictorial reorganization carried out by Velázquez in the Monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial in 1666 at the express wish of Felipe IV represent a unique opportunity to attend a magnificent museographic project in which the city plays an special role. Felipe IV resumed work on the painter, which was inaugurated in March 1654, and proposed embellishing and redecorating some rooms in the monastery where the quality of the painting needed to be improved. The king then assembled a magnificent collection of religious themes that they had recently accumulated, and as Antonio Palomino tells in 1724, when they narrates the life of Velázquez. In the year 1656, Her Majesty ordered Don Diego Velázquez to take San Lorenzo el Real 41 original paintings, some of them from the auction of the King of England, Charles Stuart, first of that name, others that he brought Velázquez from Italy, and others that he gave to His Majesty Don García de Avellaneda y Haro, Count of Castillo, who had been Viceroy of Naples, was already President of Castillo, of which Diego Velázquez made a description and memory in which engaged news of his qualities, histories and authors, and of the sites where they were placed, to show it to His Majesty with such elegance and property, which qualified her for erudition and great knowledge of art, because they are so excellent that only in him could they achieve the deserved praises. Finally, after months of work, Velázquez managed to finish the redecoration for the king's stay in the autumn of 1656. An exceptional witness in the champion of San Lorenzo, Julio Chifret, in his report of this year, said, "He the king, may God preserve him, being in better health, went to see the next day the sacristy, newly decorated with very beautiful original panel of the 10 religions that they had, which they hastened to this place, saying that those I had long intended to adore in with the most beautiful things there were in this art. Science remains will rest here forever. This sacristy is completely changed. Since it all has been decorated and gilded together with the side walls that have been plastered. Diego de Velázquez, painter and valet of His Majesty, has been several months busy arranging everything and arranged to make gold frames for the painting. This we witness Velázquez's choice of a gilded and carved frame design, which will provide uniformity to his great museographic project. on the one hand, and which informs us of the importance that will be given to the framing in what will be the highest quality sacristy of his time in Europa for his painting, with work by Rafael, Tiziano, Tintoretto, Andrea del Sarto, Campiasso, Veronese, Carracci, Sebastiano del Pombo, Guido Reni, Correggio, Van Dyck, Romano, Serodini, until its dismantling with the French invasion of 1828. Velázquez's choice was based on a curving design that was very different for the friends that were in the monastery at that time. To do so, he decided on a typology that had already been used by the altarpiece maker José de la Torre in his work in both in the sanctuary of Fuencislas, Segovia, and in Santa María la Mayor, Tordesillas. The frames that adorn the carvings and paintings are like those in the sacristy of Escorial. But de la Torre and Brother Bautista are the most prestigious altarpiece makers and the code, and the influence of their work extends throughout Castilla. In the altarpiece of the Mercedarias de Juan del Arcón de Madrid, José de la Torre used this typology for both the central painting of the altarpiece and the side ones. The third original typology is the civilian frame, which began to develop throughout the first half of the 17th century and consolidated its style from 1650 onwards. It became widespread throughout Andalusia, although there are examples throughout Spain. Its uses are survived to this day, to such an extent that it is used throughout the world when framing paintings for the Spanish school of that century as a supposed Spanish style. By the second half of the century, the civilian style was established and perfectly defined. Some significant features were absolute dependence of the extraordinary altarpieces made for the time, especially on the great innovator of the second half of the 17th century, Bernardo Simón de Pineda. The frame is flared or inverted, bringing the painting forward towards the observer with an stenographic effect. They are usually painted in dark or embossed tones. This profile is complemented with carvings in the corner and the centers of the side rails. They are inspired the Dicanesca, the Alonso Cano, with naturalistic carving for auricular forms. The carvings usually include motifs alluding to the pictorial theme, seraphim, scallop, heraldry, flowers. Thin string of pairs of beds of the edge and margin in the intercalary. The Greek personality of this style caused it to be associated with the Spanish painting of the century. It was a guarantee of the Spanishness of what was painted. Both the art dealers from the 19th century who sold this painting, of course, Murillo, Velázquez, to museums and individuals around the world used this style with many nuances. Its great popularity guaranteed. On the other hand, at the official level, in museums and institutions, it is the one chosen and you want to give added value and authenticity to the painting of the time. This psychological component has even reached on the. For finish, I hope I have aroused your curiosity and interest, and that this in the beginning of new studies of the Spanish framing of the 17th century that complete and advance your knowledge. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this first attempt.
Thank you so much, Jesus. That was absolutely fascinating. I think this talk really advances a lot about how we think about Spanish frames, and I'm very excited to hear questions at the end. Our next talk is by Marco Bai, who's coming to us from the Scuola Normale Superiore, and he similarly will be helping us to understand a much generalized and much talked about style of frame, asking the question, what really is a Maratta frame? Welcome, Marco.
Our talk today begins with a question. What is a Maratta frame? What did it really mean, Maratta frame, for the painter Carlo Maratti, after whom it was named, and for the people closest to him? Did Maratti in fact invent a new type of picture frame? In his drawing corpus, we find only a few clues about it. Some sketches show frame design drawn from ancient architecture, especially for portrait medallions, but almost nothing more. Yet when today we say Maratta in the antiques and museums context especially, we are referring to numerous different typologies of picture frames, ranging from almost bare to richly ornamented ones. So it is a widespread habit, at least since the mid-18th century, to do so. For example, we know that Joshua Reynolds, between 1758 and 1766, scored receipts in his account books for both Carlo Maratta or Marat frames, really pointing to a smooth Italian frame model, whose common name was, of course, Salvator Rosa in Italy. In the same years, the collector Edward Knight bought ornate frames as Carlo Marat frames, meaning that these two terms, Salvator Rosa and Carlo Maratti, already identified two clearly distinct frameworks models, although deeply intertwined the one with another. Apart from Sir Nicholas Penny, from whom we take this information about Reynolds, the 1990s work of Timothy Newberry, Paul Mitchell, and of course here our host Lynn Roberts were simply invaluable in terms of terminology. I hope that here I got all the technical terms right, for as we all know, the nomenclature of 6th and 18th century frames is a complicated matter, even in each own native language. Here I tried to summarize the two most correct descriptions of the typologies, dividing them in a group that claims the substantial identity of Salvatore and Maratta, and another one that instead differentiates them according to the placement of the applied ornament. It is indeed challenging to distinguish what models archival sources are actually referring to. For early modern inventory could file picture frames with phrasing such as model by Maratti or hand of Rosa. Still, that is not enough of a proof that such expressions were adopted extensively as a typology. Collectors of the time were not interested in creating a taxonomy of framing styles. We scholars today are. Suffice it to say that the main difference were traced in ornamental patterns. A Maratta and a Salvator Rosa were distincted by the number, variety, layouts of combinations of moldings and carving orders. The section or a profile was instead basically always the same, based on two opposing scotias supporting an owl beak or ogee molding, a central, usually smooth band, and a smaller decorative molding carved on the back and the side edges, as I hope you can see. Now, the layout by Salvator Rosa, usually the smooth one, was invented around 1660, and it was left unworked without any further decoration than smooth moldings. If necessary, carved acanthus leaflets could be placed at the side edge. Note the side edge. The layout by Carlo Maratti, instead, would present applique carvings with a very similar look, but located in the inner scotia of the frame. Italian literature, for example, ignored these precious classification efforts. For example, Sabatelli and Zambrano did not care to dwell in the question. The late Baroque Italy, in fact, did not know Maratta frame as a typology, although obviously widespread. It was usually called by, it was not usually called by its name in the 1750 inventory of Palazzo Corsini in Rome, studied by Silvia Papini, where many paintings by Maratti's hand are found, but in frames called Salvatore, distinguish between smooth and carved, so intagliate e lisce. If we revise the first phase of the career of Maratti, he painted frames within his pictures. In the portrait of Luke Wadding, 1658, he inserted a reproduction of the Immaculate Conception by Guido Reni, housed in some versions in a 16th century fluted frame or in a gilded scotia. Between 1670 and 1677, the sitter was supervising the works in Palazzo Altieri. Marat proposed a more traditional frame, a cassetta one, in the portrait of Cardinal Camillo Massimo, as already did Sasso Ferrato in the similar portrait of Francesco Angelo Rapaccioli back in 1643. But it was only in the 1680s, however, that Maratti introduced his own model. And we must still wait a decade for its definition in a piece of writing. Giovan Pietro Bellori, Maratti's close friend, eminent scholar, wrote the painter biography between 1690 and 1695. Previously, Bellori did not pay much attention to frames because in this first edition of his Vitae of the Pittori, Scultori, etc., of 1672, he only reports in one case that Rubens' Cycle of Maria de' Medici showed, and I quote, black wooden frames with golden arabesques that were not chosen by the artist. But then, in the life of Maratti, issues about picture framing finally really came up. The art theorist wrote that Carlos sent 2 paintings of the seasons to the Spanish Cardinal Portocarrero, thus introducing on the market, and I quote, an innovative and rich model of black frames made of pear wood, dyed to imitate ebony with very noble gilded carvings applied on a good dark background. The Swedish architect Nicodemus Tessin the Younger wrote in his travel notes from 1687-88 that he had a meeting in Rome with Bellori and Maratti inside the artist's studio, during which the host revealed that he recently invented, quote, a black and gold frame. Bellori's testimony is supported above all by this wonderful canvas by Maratti, the portrait of Cardinal Alderano Cibo. The frame depicted here, as you can see, both in the detail and the full picture, consists of an ogee side edge followed by a bead and reel motif here, a large area decorated with applique gilded carvings of acanthus leaves and sprouts on an ebonized background, and then a smooth carving that is here. Have faith in this, and it's rather large, like the Salvator Rosa layout, but black, and then to close the composition, a pin and ribbon back edge motif. Now, in 2008, Fabrizio Federici dated this painting to precisely 1688. Previously, the portrait was thought to date from the 60s, but the painting of the Immaculate Conception, this one, housed inside this Chibo frame, has been identified with the one today in Potsdam, dating from 1685 to 1688, according to Ursula Fischer. During these 3 years, Maratti was in fact engaged in crafting monumental version of the subject for the Cibo Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo that you can see here, under the patronage of Cardinal Alderano. Now, the painted Immaculate Conception frame, this one, closely matches the description of the Portocarrero seasons we already read. The date of the Portocarrero seasons is not reported by Bellori, but in his narrative, however, the Spanish works and their frames follow the Apollo and Daphne made for Louis XIV in 1681 and are indicated as loosely contemporary with an altarpiece for San Carlo ai Catinari dated 1677. So they could be easily invented at the turn of the 1670s and 80s, immediately after an important work by Maratti, the Altieri Clemenza Hall. Maratti drew here many designs for the spandrels of that hall that never actually went to be painted, and their frameworks here feature a side hedge decorated with bead and reed motif, a smooth scotia or roghi is uncertain from the graphic work, and another band where we can find a modified version of a lesbian kaima, and then a back edge here is difficult to see, but it's drawn with pearls. The ensemble is very similar to the frame visible in Alderano's portrait, although not exactly the same. But the definite proof is found in the Cardinal Postmortem Inventory published by Federici. Both the sketch, this one, of the Immaculate and the portrait of Alderano are described, I quote from the Notary Franceschini, as inside a black pier frame with leaves carved and gilded by Maratti's hand. So, again, in 1687-88, Maratti's workshop produced this drawing of Saint Joseph and the Child, where we can see the frame studied in 3 different versions here, and also with different ornaments, even in section profile. Now, the design is attributed to Giuseppe or Pierleone Ghezzi, both pupils of Maratti, for an engraving by Nicolas d'Origny. The promotion of paintings at the time of the sale was carried out, at least in parts, thanks to the choice of a particular suitable ornament. Hence the famous motto by Salvator Rosa, "The frame is the great pimp of pictures," that was quoted firstly by Filippo Baldinucci. The frames by Maratti, according to Bellori, could cover a wide range of costs, as we have seen. In this, they resemble Rosa's, whose model innovation was precisely the rather low prices that fit perfectly with a rising market system not based anymore strictly on patronage. Given that Maratti was himself an art dealer, we can also suppose that he personally designed frames, if not supervised their wood carving even. While his wife, Francesca Gommi, was responsible for selling lesser genres of painting realized by the workshop, Maratti personally dealt with the sale of paintings by his own hand and also by selected classical old masters, Titian, Michelangelo, and so on. And moreover, the drawings of him he gifted to his acquaintances and were furnished by him personally with a Salvator Rosa frames covered in glass, as Adriano Mendola has clarified. At the time of Maratti's death, no frames, nor Maratta nor Rosa, are recorded in his assets. However, according to Paulo Cohen, frames are mentioned as smooth gilded frames that could be produced in the workshop even in different colors as white, turquoise, gold, and then other models not described in detail are registered as black and gold, black with gold threading with filo d'oro, black and carved gold. Now, Bellori states that in 1671, Clement X Altieri paid the painter a substantial 300 scudi for an unframed picture of Saint Filippo Benizzi. The Pope allegedly did so out of personal appreciation for Maratti, who was previously granted the same figure for the already framed canvas. Now, my colleague Marco Massoni published recently the payments for all the frames in this cycle made for the canonization of the saint. The 10 picture frames were worth 90 scudi, circa. They all were entrusted to Girolamo Siriaci, a gilder who was also responsible for procuring and working the wood. That is a strange thing in the Roman system. Siriaci realized, I quote, cornici alla fiorentina oro renate, meaning frames in the Florentine fashion worked with sand to create a matte effect within the gilding layer. This kind of background is also found in the middle band with large acanthus leaves within the stucco frame for the Allegory of Mercy of Palazzo Altieri that shows also a pin and ribbon motif at side edge, egg and dart molding, a torus and oggi at back edge. Maratti and Bellori developed together the decoration program for this Clemenza's Hall between 1673 and 77. The two friends were competing with a fresco by Baciccio on the vault of the Gesù Church that was being painted in the exact same years across the street. That fresco, as you obviously know and can see, would have would have a rich floral frame in stucco whose function was really just to be overflown by the painting. The Altieri Clemenza responded to this brush innovation with a framing of the same outline, as you can see, but conceived as classically contained. Bellori himself claimed that this stucco frame was allegedly one of the reasons why this particular enterprise failed. The frame was already there, according to Bellori, and could not be taken down, and I quote, being it too long and too narrow, Carlo was forced to resort to partitions of the ceiling. Actually, this is a fake news by Bellori, who does not want to admit his friend's defeat. According to Leone Pascoli, who wrote in 1730, Maratti never finished decorating the hall, I quote, for some differences of opinion with Prince Altieri, unquote. Maratti deliberately chose to reference models that felt out of fashion at the time, following the examples of Annibale Carracci and of his teacher Andrea Sacchi, that both reproduced, to use Bellori words again, a great picture with its frame in the ceiling. The painter so consciously decided not to compete with his opponents in this genre of trompe-l'œil ceilings, but really to overcome it by creating an ornament that embodied classical measure and proportion of space. A few years later, in the 90s, Maratti successfully carried on a similar challenge when he remade the main altar of San Carlo al Corso. As Stella Rudolph noticed, Bellori uses the grand measures of this composition to compare Maratti with unparalleled works by Pietro Cortona and Gian Lorenzo Bernini, both at the Vallicella Church and St. Peter's Church. He emphasized how Maratti succeeded in harmonizing the layout of the architecture to his own picture's need, not vice versa, praising the picture frame especially. Bellori, you can see in the highlighted passage, details the materiality of the frame's realization. He insists on the pivotal role given to the frame and to the viewer's gaze in the success of the work, according to the theoretical approach derived from Alberti and introduced in the discourse on picture frames by Giulio Mancini and Nicolas Poussin. the frame is deemed necessary for the complete functioning of a picture, for its decorum, to give the altarpiece a proper finish and an opulence worthy of such a painting. While any practice that represents an obstacle to the vision and illumination of the piece is criticized, henceforth, starting from the mid-17th century onwards, it could often happen that a painting economic value was estimated equal or even lower than that of the frame that housed it, as evidenced by the studies of Renata Ago and Loredana Lorizzo. This caused a real hateful response from academic artists, voiced in the treatise by Monsignor Bottari that stars in his dialogue Bellori and Maratti as really champions of an enlightened classicism. Bellori here in the fiction asked Maratti his take on artisans working their way up to the profession of architects, and the painter responds that modern architecture is failing as the work as the wood carving of frames is doing, especially the frames for mirrors that were later used as picture frames. They do, I quote, badly. They work without reasoning, such as the woodworker done. Therefore, even if it seems that Maratta himself had experimented with completely golden models, such as the Cleopatra of Palazzo Venezia, if we want to be extremely precise, his frame, Maratta frame, was the black one from the Sibbo portrait, designed in the 80s, celebrated in the following decade by Bellori, and it was only the fame of the painter among foreign collectors visiting Rome afterwards, after his death in the 18th century, that ensured its widespread and consequent variation that allowed this frame to lose its initial connotation of a cheap ornamentation and then differentiating it from Rosa's model, inventing so the enigmatic term Maratta frame. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. I'm seeing a lot of applause. That was absolutely fascinating. We're now going to go north from Rome to Venice. Federica Gigante from the University of Cambridge is going to speak to us about Venetian 15th century frames with Islamic bookbinding motifs, in a talk that I'm sure will be absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Federica. Welcome.
Well, thank you for the introduction, but I must start with a disclaimer, mainly that I know very little about frames, and most of what I learned so far. So I'm here today largely to be proved wrong, and hopefully to learn from you and receive some feedback. I also realize I probably promised more than I will actually do in my talk today, so I'll just ask for forgiveness. This project on picture frames started a few years ago by chance, actually, and it's when I started to realize that people called a particular group of frames that looked vaguely like this, Orientalist frames. So since then, I've been trying to look for such type of frames on and off for a few years. And so I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference for giving me the excuse to put my thoughts in a bit of a coherent flow. I hope it will be coherent. What I realized in particular is that as a trained Islamic art historian, these decorative motifs look nothing really similar to Islamic motifs. These usually is a tendency to call everything that is vaguely scrolly or arabesque-like Islamic inspired. This is particularly surprising when the very arabesque, let us call it that way, was in fact taken from classical motifs. And you can have here a very clear example from Samarra in Iraq from the 9th century. This is one of the very earlier such examples of vine scrolls that are clearly taken from Greek or Roman art. However, there exist other categories of frames that sport much more clear connections with Islamic art. One of them is that of frames showing pseudo-Kufic motifs, such as this Gentile da Fabriano nativity at the Getty Museum, though I must confess I did not find many of those. What is more relevant, however, is another group of frames, and that's the one on which my research so far has concentrated. A very good example of this is this Jacopo Bellini Madonna and Child. This group is completely different in nature from anything that I had seen before. This is probably not the original frame. As you can see, the actual painting shows a arch motif around it, but it's probably a contemporary sort of frame. What is interesting to me is that the type of decorative motifs that are sported here are nothing like the previous ones, but are very clear motifs taken from Islamic art, and very formally so. So this is a detail, and I'm just going to compare it with a drawing because it will make it slightly more clear here. And you can see that when you take the decoration apart, you find, for example, palmettes, or the so-called square palmette in the decoration, here outlined in green and yellow. And incidentally, this is a motif that appears very clearly after the second Mongol invasion, when the movement of people across Central Asia moved decorative motifs from the Eastern Asia side all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. And so it is quite interesting that we should find it here at the beginning of the 15th century. A second example of this type of frame I found completely by chance at the Fitzwilliam Museum, where I partly work in Cambridge. This frame was literally left in a corner of the storerooms, pretty much abandoned, upside down and forgotten. But I could spot it was something very similar to what I was at the time working on. It came into the museum as a frame of a Fra Angelico drawing, which is this Dead Christ. It is clear, however, that the drawing was never meant to be framed in this frame. Let aside that it is quite tiny, it's 35.5 centimeters by 27.4, which is 14 by 11 inches, while the frame is considerably bigger. Besides, the drawing was probably never meant to be framed, not in this way. I had a look at all the labels, and it appears that the frame was acquired at auction in Paris in 1931. That is just before the frame and the drawing entered the collection of the Fitzwilliam Museum, but I was not able to go any further back with my research. What is most interesting, and you can see here, is again the same type of motif with the palmette in green, and this so-called square palmette, which is square because it has this sort of flat part on it. And I apologize for a bit of jargon, but I hope I can walk you through that. If I take you to other elements of the frame, the same very formal motifs appear throughout. Here you can see this kind of cusp. Again, it is made with half palmettes, but it's a very formal type of decorative motif. And you can see also the so-called loop palmette, which is that kind of, it looks a bit like a hot air balloon with the two lines going across it. And I could really spend more time here dissecting these motifs, but it is really just to show the sheer difference between what this is and what a general scroll is. This is clearly copied by something. It's very formal, and whoever made it had a prototype in front of them. There is another type of frame that I came across, and a very good example is this Madonna and Child by Giovanni Bellini. And you can see that the frame in general doesn't present the same motifs as the other ones, but only in the medallions. And again, in these medallions, it is very formal. You're now quite familiar with the square palmette, so you can see it here. Now, what is the most important question to me is, where do these elements come from? How were they transferred from Islamic art into these Venetian picture frames? And you might have noticed that all the paintings they frame are dated from the late 15th century. Of course, they are very much omnipresent in Islamic art. Everywhere they're found on metalwork, they're found on wooden carvings. Sorry for not the very good quality, but you can see the same type of palmettes and motifs we've just analyzed so far. You can find it in ceramics. I'm just showing some examples, but they're pretty much everywhere, or on architecture. This is a stone carving from Cairo, and you can see the same exact motifs: the palmette, this cast motif, square palmette, and the loop palmette. Basically, everything that we call arabesque is made out of these elements, and they never change in shape or form. So what exactly served as the physical transfer from the Islamic world to these frames? Of course, we are in Venice, and Venice, as everyone knows at the time, especially in the late 15th century, was a place where Islamic material culture was very much at home. But the level of accuracy these frames show demonstrate that there was something very particular they were copying at the time. So before I try to give you an answer to this question, let us very briefly talk about the development of such type of tabernacle frames in late 15th century Italy. It is the opinion of scholars that such frames developed around the Veneto area at the end of the 15th century. Now, what you have before is this type of Gothic altarpiece, typical of the late medieval and early Renaissance period, such as this polyptych by Paolo Veneziano, made in about 1350. Now, as you can see, this is a completely different type of structure. And as I said, I'm not even going to venture into talking about technical terminology, but the structure of the painting is very much intrinsically connected to the frame. And very often, always these pieces were conceived together with the elaborate framing. This was something that was about to change towards the mid and end of the 15th century with something a lot more formalized and following classicizing motifs, which is, of course, the very essence of the Renaissance change, this push towards more classicizing general visual motifs. This Andrea Mantegna altarpiece from Cenzeno illustrates it very, very clearly, and we should see it later as well in the talk. Here, the complexity of the more Gothic altarpiece has given way to a more formalized and easier understanding of the spaces, but what's more important is the use of scrolls and elements taken from Greek Roman antiquity. This movement towards classical antiquity is evident in every type of frame. And this example of Pietro Lombardo from Venice, from a door frame rather than a picture frame, is a clear example. You can see the type of decorative details that were being used and the elements that were being taken. They are exactly the same type of motifs that we also find on frames. And these, especially these small frames that were meant for private devotion, it's called tabernacle frame. And they're usually very small, and this is the proof that they're very small. They were usually meant to sit in people's houses for private type of devotion. And you can see here the exact same type of classicizing motifs being present in this frame. And as I said, they were usually made to stay in people's homes, and you can see a very clear example in situ in this painting by Vittore Carpaccio, The Dream of St. Ursula, where you can spot just by the bed a frame very similar to the one we've just looked at, and that this was clearly meant to be for private devotion is evident from the sort of candle arm that extends, where you'd put and light a candle, from the presence of an ila just underneath it, and also from the presence of, surprisingly, this kind of water holy water sprinkler. This is particularly interesting because the shape of the holy water sprinkler that you see here, it's clearly a type of Mamluk bucket shape. And it's quite amazing that one such Mamluk, so Egyptian metalwork turned into a holy water sprinkler is actually still present in the Cathedral of Treviso. So it really is a witness to the fact that these objects were circulating in Venice in the desert. Now let's have a look at the frame in more details. I'm concentrating on this Alvise Vivarini frame, which is probably original, although I probably don't have the skills to be able to say it fits the frame perfectly nonetheless. There is various sections that present these type of Islamic decorative motifs, the top one and inner frame one. And these are the ones, of course, I'd like to concentrate on. The rest is exactly what I said earlier. I'm very classicizing type of scrolls. What is more peculiar here, however, is, and it's quite different from the previous one, is the presence of these kind of mandola type decorations spaced out evenly around the Islamic band. Though this has lost all its decorative details, it is striking how similar it is to the type of Islamic mandola that you see on book decorations. And this is exactly what I basically show you so far. It's just a simplification, but I will show you examples of it on original artwork. This is a very peculiar type of polylobed mandola that it's normally found in the middle of Islamic bookbindings from the Ottoman Mamluk world all the way to the Persian world. And you can see here a fairly contemporary Persian Turkish binding example, but you can find it really from everywhere. This is from Iran, and it's a type of decoration that really persists throughout the history of Islamic art, and you can find it all the way to the 19th century. The characteristic is always the same, that of having this elongated shape in the middle, polylobed with the same type of decorative motifs we saw so far, and the other types of decoration in the corners. Why books then? Well, books were probably one of the most portable objects, one of the chief vehicles of the transfer of decorative motifs across continents. We know that travelers going to the Holy Land brought books with them and very often returned with books from their journeys. They were portable, they were non-fragile and very small, so easily carried. What is more importantly is that these type of books is exactly the sort of style of bindings that was being used by humanists in the Veneto area at the time to bind their own books. And that these were very common and popular, you can see by looking at the paintings. I've taken the same San Zeno altarpiece that we just saw before. And you can see, for example, one of the saints is holding a book, very similar in style. This is highly simplified, but you can see that in a sort of central decorative type. Just a reminder that European books at the time were much more even. They didn't have this kind of pasteboard motifs, and they were usually all symmetrical, if not plain. They had just more like grid-like decorations and metal clasps. You can find the same in this Vittore Carpaccio St. Augustine in his study, again from the Veneto area. And if you zoom closer to the desk of St. Augustine, you can see a book that is clearly an Islamic binding. And these were the type of bindings that were being used and the techniques were being adopted at the time in the Veneto area. It is particularly the opinion of the scholars that these kind of Mamluk and Ottoman bindings were the sort of elements that inspired also humanist book bindings. And we have some very clear example also that have survived until today. So one such example is this upper cover from Petra Canzonieri and Trionfi. The book was probably made in Florence in the 1460s, 1470s. It's currently kept at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but the binding was most likely put together in Venice. And I'm not going to bore you any longer, but you can see the exact same type of motifs that we have seen so far being present in this frame. You can see the palmettes in green, the square palmettes, the clasp, the loop palmette. Every single detail very formally taken and borrowed from Islamic art. And again, you can see the similarity in the types of shape of this mandola-like decoration. It is certain that both the book bindings and the frames were part of a general environment of the transfer of decorative motifs, of which Venice was very much a protagonist. However, it is clear to me that the clues of these very precise details that are only found in book decoration lead us to the direction of the adoption of motifs through bindings and manuscripts coming from the Islamic world. It is also possible to go through the various examples that I showed you earlier and highlight a sort of transition from the earliest types, like this frame by Alvise Varini, which, as I said, is on a painting dated about 1480, 1485, probably contemporary. And you can see that this clear bookbinding motif is present pretty much everywhere on the inner frame and the top part. But this is something that changes with time and looking at various other frames. This is something that comes from a private collection in Madrid, and I couldn't find a better photo, but it's a very similar type of frame to the one I showed you just now. It has the top part and the central section that show Islamic motifs, and here the mandola type is reduced largely to this central section, and it doesn't repeat as it did before in the corners and the other parts. Then you find frames like this one we've already looked at, where this motif has completely disappeared. What has remained, however, is these roundels that, quite interestingly, you find again in other types of frames, like this one, where it's only the roundel that has, in a way, survived the evolution. Now, what I'm hoping to do more in future than now, with the few examples that I have found, is in a way to try and put together an evolution of this type of frames, and in particular tie it to the type of commissions for which these frames were made, and try to understand whether there was a conscious choice from the part of the commissioner in choosing one particular frame as opposed to the other, or whether this was just a very shared pan-Mediterranean vocabulary. What is very clear, however, that this type of frames clearly borrowed motifs, copying directly artworks and most likely book bindings and manuscript motifs. I hope in future to be able to identify more and add them to a corpus in order to make a bit more of a coherent whole, and hope that you have feedback on this. And if you came across some, please do send them along. Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. I will just say I gasped aloud when you pulled the examples of the book bindings from the paintings and connected them directly to the frames. That was really, really striking and incredible spotting on your part. So we'll now take a 10-minute pause before we go to the next session. So hope you can get up and stretch or make yourself a coffee or whatever you need at home or your office, wherever you're joining us from. And we'll return in 10 minutes for the next session. Thank you very much.